Thank you, Ara, for the really kind introduction. Can people hear me in back? If I just, I'm hugely grateful to have been invited here. This is, in my mind, one of the finest intellectual communities in the world, and it's a delight to go through and talk to my old friends and colleagues and meet some new ones. So this is terrific. I want to talk today about religious belief. Now, we possess many beliefs. People believe that grass is typically green, and that unsupported objects fall down. And these beliefs pose a lot of puzzles. Nobody knows precisely how to represent them in the brain. Nobody knows precisely how we come to learn them. But they aren't that mysterious. After all, grass really is green. Unsupported objects do fall down. So it doesn't pose a huge puzzle why we possess such beliefs. Religious beliefs are different. And this difference was nicely expressed by H.L. Mencken, the famous curmudgeon and atheist. He wrote, "How is it possible for a human brain to be divided into two insulated halves? One functioning normally, naturally, and even brilliantly, another capable only of such ghastly balderdash which issues from the minds of Baptist evangelists. Such balderdash takes various forms, but it is at its worst when it is religious. Why should this be so? What is there in religion that completely flabbergasts the wits of those who believe in it?" Now, it's not quite the most respectful introduction to a topic of religion, but in fact, even those of us who are theists could agree with the spirit of Mencken's inquiry, in that the beliefs we have that come under the category of religion seem to be sort of different from everyday beliefs. They aren't acquired in the same way, they aren't understood in the same way, and it does pose a puzzle, how come we possess them? We know that the sort of beliefs that we're talking about here are a belief in deities and spirits like God, beliefs in the divine creation of humans and other creatures, and other beliefs such as life after death. And we know the people in this room don't need persuading. These beliefs are quite pervasive. Most humans are religious, and most religions adhere to such belief systems. The beliefs are particularly prevalent in the United States, the country in which I live, where over half believe in miracles, angels, and the devil. About 2/3 believe that God created humans and other animals, either directly as spontaneous creation or by guiding evolution. A bit more believe Jesus was raised from the dead, and just about everybody believes in God. So those are the sort of puzzles I'm interested in today. And we could break these down into two categories. We could talk about the puzzle of universal and near-universal tendencies to believe things. And then we could talk about differences across cultures and within cultures. And my talk will fall into two halves, corresponding roughly to these two questions. Now, one theory of where these beliefs come from is that we have a special dedicated faculty in our minds that is specialized to producing these beliefs. So this was the view of John Calvin. So Calvin, in the 1500s, suggested that God implanted within us a desire to believe in God, a propensity to believe in God that exists before any sort of schooling and experience. Atheists have a stunted system due to some sort of personal trauma or malice, have decided to stunt their natural system, but this natural system should exist in all of us. More recently, Jesse Bering has argued that certain religious beliefs are specific biological adaptation. So motivated in part by the work of Aaron Nornzine and others, Bering proposed that a belief in God keeps us moral. The belief in the scrutiny of what ours called a big God makes us better people. And he argued as part of an adaptation for our moral system, we have evolved a propensity to believe in such gods. I'm interested here in exploring an alternative perhaps most famously articulated by Pascal Boyer, which is that there's no specific biological adaptation for religious belief. Rather, religion's an accident. Religion's a byproduct. We possess certain foundational assumptions about the social world, and these make certain religious beliefs natural. So I'll talk about three such assumptions. The first is animism, a general tendency to see people and human action and agency in the world around us. And this has different manifestations. So one is a natural human tendency to see faces popping out of objects that aren't really people. And there's some famous examples of this. Somebody had discovered the Virgin Mary in a grilled cheese sandwich, causing quite a fuss. Someone else discovered the nun bun, the face of Mother Teresa inside a baked good. And about 4 days ago, I found on the web this more recent example, which is not entirely impressive, but bird dropping showing images of Christ. Now, another manifestation of this is to see in the movements, even in movements of simple geometric figures, intelligent animate motion, emotions, plans, goals. The classic example here comes from Hyder and Simmel in 1944, where they showed people the movements of various geometrical figures, and then asked them later to tell a story about it. And it turns out that people have no problem establishing a narrative about these individuals, giving them goals and desires, even different genders, based on fairly abstract patterns of movement. And this all attests to the prevalence we have to interpret these things in such a way. More recently, there's been a lot of developmental research showing that even young infants will interpret geometrical figures, will interpret simple figures as having beliefs and desires, as having goals, behaving in a rational manner, even perhaps having moral qualities. And I'm going to say absolutely nothing about this, except to note that this work was done, this is work led by Kylie Hamlin, and I'll talk about this in more detail tomorrow in my better talk. No, this is my better talk. And then to note that Stuart Guthrie argued I think convincingly, a lot of the beliefs that we associate with religion are the byproduct of this animistic tendency. In that we see in this world, we are naturally prone to see deities, to see spirits in the movements and in the structures of everyday objects. As he very poetically puts it, the clothes have no emperor. The second case study is dualism. And dualism, many of us associate dualism through the philosophical framing of this as a sort of a philosophical theory of the relationship between body and soul. And here the major champion is Descartes. So Descartes wrote, summarizing the theory of dualism, "I knew that as a substance, the whole essence or nature of which is to think, and that for its existence there is no need of place or any material thing. That is to say, the soul by which I am, what I am, is entirely distinct from body." Descartes, this intuition is not, of course, limited to philosophers. It shows up in many aspects of everyday life. It shows up in a belief that many of us have that when we die, we will go to heaven. And not our bodies, but us. Somehow our bodies will remain in the ground or will turn to dust. But we ourselves will survive the death of our body, going to heaven in our culture, or reincarnating in another culture, or occupying a spirit world in another culture. It shows up in non-religious manifestations. You could immediately read the title of this book, "Help, I'm Trapped in My Teacher's Body," and immediately understand what the book is about. It's about a student who, due to one various scientific mishap, ends up himself occupying his teacher's body. Of course, his body doesn't jam into a teacher's body. He does. This is part of a series. It includes "Help, I'm Trapped in My Sister's Body," "Help, I'm Trapped in My Gym Teacher's Body," derivative of that, and my favorite, "Help, I'm Trapped in My Dog's Body." So I became interested in the question of whether we're natural-born dualists, whether this assumption of dualism is something which manifests itself because we're living in a dualist culture and dualist beliefs all around us, or whether there's a natural tendency of humans to adopt a dualist belief, perhaps because our cognitive systems for reasoning about the physical world and our cognitive systems for reasoning about the social world don't quite mesh. And I got into the idea of this question, actually, through a sort of a surprise event that happened in my life. And it revolved around my son, Max, when he was 6 years old. And this is a picture of him. And the situation was, it was very late, and I told him he had to go to sleep. And he said to me, "You can make me stay in bed, but you can't make me go to sleep. It's my brain." And I said, "Okay, well, I'll stay up." I had some questions for him, made us some coffee. And then I said, "What does the brain do?" A sort of open-ended question, accumulate data. He said, "Millions of things. A person could die if their brain was badly hurt. It is an extremely important part of the body." And then I pressed him. I said, "Does the brain do this? Does the brain do that?" I asked him various questions. And he said, "The brain does seeing, hearing, smelling, and most important of all, the brain was involved in thinking. But it does not do dreaming, feeling sad, or loving his brother." And Max said, "That's what I do, though my brain might help me out." So in order to explore this, I collaborated with my colleague Frank Heil and graduate student Catherine Cho. And we did a series of studies testing this in various ways, including a study involving brain transplants, where we told children stories about brain transplants, such as a boy's head into the brain of a pig. Now, and it turns out that at a certain age, when children are old enough to understand this, they go through a stage where what they say is, you'll get a very smart pig. But still one that has pig memories, pig personality, and pig desires. They believe that the brain is like what they believe is the brain's a cognitive prosthesis. It's a person could use it to enhance his or her computing power. But it's not the self. And other research by Susan Gelman, Carl Johnson, and others have found the same. Young children believe the brain is important for sort of cognitive effort, like mathematics or memory, but not for your experiences or your beliefs or your desires. It turns out, I think, that some residual form of this belief shows up even in the most highly educated adults. So I've often been struck by the reporting in science, in the New York Times and other science sections, of contemporary results from cognitive neuroscience. My favorite being where often there's this sort of often the results of the studies themselves are important and worth knowing about, but often people are just amazed that the brain does that. My favorite example is this headline: "In pain and joy of envy, the brain may play a role." May! If the brain didn't play a role, it would be the discovery of the millennium, as it would prove Cartesian dualism was mistaken. But the headline writer didn't think, wow, the brain might be involved in that too. Recently, I wrote this up in a book called Descartes' Baby, published many years ago, where I talked about the evidence. And since then, there's been more evidence. There's been some work by Jesse Baring on afterlife beliefs. There's been some work here at UBC looking at evidence, both developmental and cross-cultural, suggesting that there's an intuitive dualism, that people will naturally come to the conclusion that a mind can jump from one body to another. But what I want to focus on, and not on the evidence for my claim, but on an argument against it, because I think the argument against it is a serious one. I think it's basically correct. And it focuses on one aspect of Cartesian dualism that stands out as among the others and doesn't seem to me or to anybody else who commented on my view very plausible. Is that there's no need of place. Now, it's true that we naturally construe ourselves as, arguably, construe ourselves as immaterial, can leave our body, can drift off to heaven, is not contingent on the body. But the idea that it has no location seems to many to be unintuitive. So if you ask people, where are you? Where is yourself? You will get an answer. You're in your head. You do have a place. Now, this belief in the location of a self seems like an interesting question, because maybe you believe you're in your head, among other reasons, because you know your brain's in your head, and you're a materialist. Another possibility, though, is that this is a fundamental intuition that yourself has this place that shows up even prior to knowledge of the brain and the brain's role in mental life. And this is something I explored in collaboration with Christina Starmans, who's a graduate student at Yale. And what we did was we used an indirect method with children and with adults to figure out where they think people are, where they think the location of a person is. And what we did was we showed them a series of pictures with, in one case, a girl and a fly floating around her in different places. And we would show them pairs of pictures, and we would simply ask, in which picture is the fly closer to Mary? Now, in some way, that's a weird question. They're both equally close to Mary. Maybe if it was in the center, it would be closer to the sort of center of her. But they're both equally close to Mary. But then when we compiled the data using sort of looking at the Ola contrast, we found that they tend to think the fly was over here, behind her eyes, or around that part of her face right here. Now, this original study had certain flaws. Maybe they're doing this because a fly buzzes, so you hear a fly buzzing. Or maybe a fly is distracting around a face. Or maybe you'd most notice a fly above the face. So we replicated it with a snowflake, and we found the same sort of pattern. Now, this, we thought, could be an interesting case study of a dissociation between tacit beliefs and more explicit beliefs. And so this work was published in Cognition last year, but this is some unpublished work. What we did was we used an online survey method to ask people from different countries where the self is. So we forget about this indirect method. We say, where is a person? Like a person could occupy a different body, but where do you think you are? Americans said this: you're in your head. But the India population was more mixed, saying you're in your chest. There would be just as many would say you're in your chest as you're in your head. Then we gave them the same Mary questions that we gave in the previous study to remind you this is the data from the previous study, and that's the data from Indian adults, where, again, they were perfectly clear that the fly was closer to Mary when it was round her eyes. The third foundation after animism and dualism is creationism. So creationism, like dualism, has long been around as sort of a philosophical position, and many people have argued that the design that's apparent in a natural world screams out for intentional explanation. So Cicero wrote, when you see a sundial or a water clock, you see that it tells the time by design and not by chance. How then can you imagine that the universe as a whole is devoid of purpose and intelligence? More recently, the creationist Michael Behe wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times where he said, the physical marks of design are visible in aspects of biology. In the absence of any compelling non-design explanation, we are justified in thinking that real intelligent design was involved in life. It turns out that this trait, this jumping from the existence of design to a designer, shows up in children. So now many investigators, including Piaget a while ago and more recently Evans Petrovich and Deborah Kellerman, have found that children are more creationists than their parents. So if you ask children and parents, often from the same family, questions like, who put the sun in the sky, where did mountains come from, where did the very first dog come from, they're more prone to give creationist explanations. Kellerman asked the question in a different way. She showed children and adults different items and asked, what are they for? And gave them an option of saying they're not for anything. So children think that clocks are for telling time, and so do adults. Children think body parts, like the paw of an animal, has a function, and so do adults. But children are more prone than adults to think that an animal or a mountain itself is for something. So a mountain might be for climbing. Recently, my colleagues at Yale, led by George Newman, have published a PNAS paper where they found even younger children have sort of systematic intuitions that design calls out for intentional creation. So I'll tell you about two of the studies they did. And one of the ones done with 4-year-olds, they showed different objects in different arrays. And the question was, what did the girl do? Did she make this or did she make this? Turns out children are split. They kind of go 50-50. But then you talk about the wind blowing things about, and you say, what did they do? This or this. They almost unanimously say it made a mess. The wind can't create order. Then he did an experiment with 12-month-olds, using a looking time methodology to measure surprise at different configurations. So there were 4 setups. In 2 of them, there's a ball. In 2 of them, there's an agent that moves around like an animate being. And then in 2 of them, there's disorder created. Some orderly things become messy. And in 2 of them, messy things become orderly. And the question is, you look at the looking time measures to see what are babies surprised by. So here's one of the movies babies saw. And that's a ball creating order out of disorder. And out of the 4 stimulus items, that was the one that surprised them. Babies were comfortable with a ball creating a mess. Babies were comfortable with an animate being either creating order or creating a mess. But when they saw order being created, if it was created by a non-agent, they were surprised by this, suggesting they have an expectation that it's intentional creatures, not balls, that create order. This is a sort of creationism about objects in the natural world, about structure in the natural world. More recently, I've been collaborating with a graduate student at Yale, Coney Banerjee, and Coney is interested in belief in an order that there's a natural order to reality, that events happen for a reason. And her prediction is that children will be more prone to accept teleological, purpose-based explanations for events than would be adults. So she did a series of studies. In one study, what she did was she told children and adults a story about a girl who lost her teddy bear. And they had to choose. This is a methodological design used by Deb Kellerman, which we're adopting here. They had to choose, who do you believe? And there are 2 different stories. And who are you favoring? So Joey thinks it was because Monica accidentally left her teddy bear on the school bus. That's a standard sort of causal explanation. Bobby thinks it was to make Monica learn to be more careful with her things. And that gives a reason to this. What we find is the children are far more prone to accept a teleological explanation, so this is acceptance for the teleological explanation, than are adults. Now, this being the first experiment, it was limited in certain ways, so one immediate limitation you might notice is maybe what's happening is the younger children aren't teleological, but what the younger children are doing is they're misinterpreting this thing. Maybe they're reading it as, well, it made Monica more careful for things. That was a result of this. And what the difference, developmental difference, is just attending to the subtleties of grammar. So we did another version. And now all the kids are told us, Monica lost her favorite stuffed teddy bear. Because she lost her teddy bear, Monica learned to be more careful for things. So we're just stipulating this. Now there's a disagreement. Joey thinks Monica learned this important lesson, and Joey thinks this is definitely the reason why she lost her teddy bear. Bobby thinks Monica learned this important lesson, but Bobby thinks it's definitely not the reason why she lost her teddy bear. The developmental transition happens later, but still the children are twice as likely to accept the teleological account as the adults, suggesting that this sort of intuitive, this belief in purpose and design extends not only to things in the world or animals, but also possibly to events. So what I've suggested is that foundational assumptions of social world can help maybe explain certain universals that show up across different religions, such as animism, dualism, and creationism. But this is, of course, just part of the story, because what's equally obvious, along with the universals, is human variation. So let's focus on this a bit. So just one example from religion. Tim Taylor describes a certain afterlife belief, a belief in reanimation. So this belief is that after a loved one dies, the soul will go to heaven, but at some point, or will go into spirit world, but at some point, very quickly, unless you do something to stop it, it will try to reanimate the body. And you have to keep the body from coming to life. This is not an afterlife belief I possess, or anybody in my culture possesses. So you need to explain why some people hold such a belief and other people hold a belief you go to heaven or hell or you're reincarnated or so on. Or take creationism. The people of this planet have very different views as to whether or not they accept creationism or they accept a scientific worldview in evolution instead. Those of you sitting in back, here's the United States. That's not good to be down here, but the United States is unusually creationist. And then within the United States, there's considerable variation in what people believe. So this is from Gallup poll all the way running from the early 80s to the present. And what you'll see is this top line are people who believe in strong creationism. God created humans in their current form. The line below it is evolution occurred, but God guided the process. And the line below this is humans evolved, and God had played no role in the process. So any theory has to explain the differences across cultures, but also differences within cultures. Or a more local example from Canada. I'm nothing if not appropriate to the place I'm at. A 2011 poll found that 14% of people had a strong creationist view. 19% said divine guidance, and 58% said humans evolved through natural selection. There are two common sense views about the variation in religious belief. One is that culturally specific beliefs are learned by absorbing culturally specific facts. And the second is scientifically accurate beliefs that emerge through an understanding of science. I want to suggest that this is incomplete and this is just false. And my work here is actually done in collaboration with Dina Weisberg, who wrote a theoretical paper with me on this topic. Let's deal with the first one. This view is nicely summarized by Richard Dawkins, who writes, "A human child is shaped by evolution to soak up the culture of her people. When you are pre-programmed to absorb useful information at a high rate, it is hard to shut out pernicious or damaging information at the same time. It is no wonder that child brains are gullible, open to almost any suggestion, vulnerable to subversion, easy prey to Moonies, Scientologists, and nuns. Like immune-deficient patients, children are wide open to mental infections that adults might brush off without effort." The view here is that the child's a sponge. Now, there are reasons to doubt this, that children's psychology is as sponge-like as Dawkins says it is. For one thing, children get information from many sources. Some of the information can be false due to ignorance, and later on in life, some of this information can be false due to malevolence. People can lie to children. It's very useful to be able to sort it out. It's very important to be able to sort it out. And in fact, children are highly sensitive to exploitation in other domains, like sharing and with siblings. So if a child's with her sibling, and the sibling takes 5 of the cookies and leaves her 1 and says, "This is fair," the child's not going to believe it. The child's going to reject certain sources of information. And in fact, the empirical work, and this is work done by Susan Birch and her colleagues, among others, suggests that children, in fact, are selective. They're selective learners. They will attenuate their learning based on the confidence of the person providing information, certainly based on a person's past reliability. And they will attenuate it based on age, though here the story is complicated. When it comes to facts, there's some evidence that children prefer adults over children when deciding who to learn for. But when it comes to aspects of language like accent, there's some evidence that children prefer children over adults, which makes a sort of logical sense, since the children that they're with is the community that they're going to be entering with and have to communicate with. This issue of selective learning raises some interesting puzzles. I've long been interested in the learning of obscenity by children, because also everything else just can be ostensively taught. This is a this is a this, or learned from context. But obscenity has a special status. And in order to learn obscenity, children have to figure out, monitor subtle cues. So just 2 anecdotes for this. One anecdote was, as part of an informal experiment, my wife and I tried to teach our children a new swear word. At the time, it was eBay. So eBay had just, so whenever they say, "Oh, eBay," and our children found this amusing and somehow found this as funny and did not ever treat it as an obscenity, despite our best efforts. Somehow they filtered it out. The second one is an example of learning gone wrong. Slightly off-color story, and I apologize for this. But my son Max, actually, it was again Max, had a babysitter named Dina for a long time, and at one point he comes up to me and he says, "Dad, do you know what the worst swear word in the world is?" And I said, "No, what is it?" And he leaned over and he whispered, "Damn." I said, "Oh, okay, okay." So yeah, that is pretty bad. I understand that. So why do you find it? Why do you think it's so bad? Said, "Well, Dina talks on the phone all the time and she swears. She says fucking shit, but she never says damn." So now, so you might say, okay, so children are selective. They're a selective sponge. But that's not true either, for an interesting reason. Certain beliefs have a strange status. And maybe religious beliefs fall in this category. So Scott Atran says, in a response to some attacks on religious beliefs by the sort of so-called new atheists, says they shouldn't be taking these beliefs literally. Certain core religious beliefs, like poetic metaphors, are literally senseless in that they altogether lack truth conditions. That is, there is no logical or empirical criteria for judging whether such utterances are true or not. Now, I don't think that that's right. I don't think it's entirely right. People insist these beliefs are true. They teach them to their children. They believe that at least some of them should be taught to all children. They are defensive when people try to teach other beliefs about children. Here's one of my favorite Onion headlines. But I think Atran is right pointing out the special status of religious belief, something also pointed out by the philosopher Dan Dennett, which is that people are strangely reflective about these religious beliefs. So this is a point also remarked by the sociologist Alan Wolf. So Wolf writes, there are people who believe often passionately in God, even if they can't tell others all that much about the God in which they believe. And I think what we're seeing here is what one could call double deference. So people defer to experts when deciding which beliefs to adopt. But also, people defer to experts as to the precise content of the belief and or the grounds for believing it, sometimes known as the division of cognitive labor. What I want to suggest is that this is not special to religion, that it also shows up in science and morality. So do science. Think to yourself for a second, how old is the Earth? Well, I know how old the Earth is. It is 4.54 billion years old. I know this because I looked it up in Wikipedia. I have no idea how they came to that number. But now that I know that's a number, I'm pretty confident it's true. So if any of you believe that the Earth is 6,000 years old, I would laugh at you for your ignorance, even though I have no idea why that number up there is correct. But I believe it because although I don't know the grounds for it, I trust the people who tell me it. I trust the scientists who presumably write the Wikipedia pages, one hopes. And there's other beliefs that have, so this is the Canadian data again. And people who study religious belief and so on, psychologists are fascinated by people in the first two categories and talk about why do people believe this. But let's look closely at the people who believe humans evolved through natural selection. And I will tell you the one thing we know about the 58% of people in Canada who think humans evolved through natural selection. The vast majority have no idea what natural selection is. If you ask them to describe it, they would say, well, you know, things evolve. And then when you push them on it, like you ask them, so how did a giraffe's neck get so long? Either they would have no idea, or they would propose a view that there's some sort of mysterious evolutionary force that across the course of generations stretches out the giraffe's neck to satisfy its need to reach tall fruit. A view associated, of course, not with Darwin, but Lamarck. So why, then, what determines whether you believe that God created animals in their current form, or whether animals evolved through natural selection? I think the answer has nothing to do with what you know. I mean, for some people, for some small proportion of scientists or theists, it might. But for the vast majority of us, it reduces to the question of who we trust. Do you trust religious figures or do you trust scientific figures? Take an example, a moral example now. And this is my favorite moral example. It was Lynn Westmoreland, who was a congressman, and he advocated that the Ten Commandments should be on display in government buildings. He then had the misfortune to show up on a television program known as the Colbert Report, where Stephen Colbert plays sort of a faux conservative and asked him various questions. And in the course of this, he got a question he could have never expected to get for his entire life. And I'll show you the clip if the sound works for this.
I think if we were totally without them, we may lose a sense of our direction. What are the top You want me to name them all? Yeah. Don't lie. Don't steal.
Now, so two things. First thing, the day after his representatives say this cut was unfairly edited, and he made it through 5. The second thing is he was ridiculed for what it was said to be hypocrisy. I don't think this is hypocrisy at all. I think he really did view the Ten Commandments as important, and that people should also view them as important, though he didn't know what they were. But this is a form of double deference. The same way, I think it's very important that people believe in natural selection, even though it's possible I really don't really know exactly what natural selection is. There are other examples. This is a nice study done by Jeffrey Cohen, where he asked different groups of Americans about different welfare policies. One of them, the top one, was by American standards insanely generous. The second one, the bottom one, is by American standards insanely stingy. They were either, the Americans given these policies and asked to judge them were either Republican or Democrat, and they were told that they were either thought up by a Republican or a Democrat. It turned out that the actual facts about these policies had little force on whether or not they accepted them. What determined whether they accepted them was somebody of their same party endorsing them. Importantly, nobody later knew that this was why they endorsed them. They defended them on the merits once they were asked about them, not being aware that it was a congruence in political party that was driving their intuition. A final moral example, this is the evolution of Barry Bonds, is steroids. A graduate student of mine, Isaac Giroudi, was very interested in certain moral intuitions. He took it upon himself to ask, what do people have against steroids? If you ask people, are use of steroids wrong? They say they definitely are. People will rank them worse than betting on a game that you yourself are involved in, and they believe they should have criminal penalties. Isaac was simply interested in the question, why? What do people think is wrong? And it turned out he spent 2 years of an otherwise distinguished graduate career finding no answer at all to this question. He must have done dozens of experiments. So, for instance, some people would say, well, they destroy your body. They're very bad for you. They destroy your body, give you heart conditions and so on. So, okay. And then you ask another group, okay, so there's a new form of steroid that comes out, and it doesn't destroy your body. It doesn't do anything bad to your body. In fact, it gives you immunity to colds, and you're better. It's still exactly as wrong. Some people say, well, it's cheating because it's illegal. Okay, what if it was legal? Still be wrong. He came to the conclusion, which I think is right, that people think steroids are wrong because people think steroids are wrong. In other words, which isn't as circular as it sounds, people, for whatever reason, there's sort of an idea that steroids are wrong. Other people notice that other people believe steroids are wrong, and they assume steroids are wrong. Just in the same way that when running shoes were first introduced, they were viewed as a form of cheating. And now nobody believes that anymore. So things change just because people monitor community standards. I've suggested that religious belief is a product of universal and near universal tendencies. Is a product of, for the universal tendencies, foundational stances that shape our common sense understanding of the world. And for the differences, they're largely due to deference, often double deference, to trusted authorities. I think this holds much the same for scientific belief. That our scientific beliefs, our intuitive scientific beliefs, are grounded either in our common sense understanding or deference, sometimes double deference, to authority. And I think this holds as well for moral belief. I think the same considerations hold. And in my talk tomorrow, I'm going to talk a little bit about these foundational stances that are operative in our moral psychologies. Now, it might look at this point that I'm saying science and religion and morality are all the same. And this is actually not my view. I think in particular, science and religion have rather an irredeemable clash against each other. I think because the actual methods and procedures of science differ from those of religion. So I think that there is, in fact, a difference. But I do think, so I don't think that, but I do think that. I think that in the heads of non-experts, folk science, folk religion, and folk morality come from the same psychological sources. Or to put it more succinctly, there's nothing special about religion. Thank you. Hi.
So I'm curious if we can combine the stuff you had about children being teleological, I think that's Coney, and the double deference, or the deference. So basically, parents say a lot of crazy things to their children because children want to know why, and parents they make up stories to answer the why, because children don't take because I said so that well. And so in some cases, you can imagine a parent giving their kid that lesson, like you lost your teddy because, I'm using it as a way to give you this lesson. And so is there potentially some sort of doubling up here in which the deference to parents as a expert in all things why plus...
Yeah, that's a thoughtful comment. I think that's right. I think that my bet would be that cross-culturally, even with young children, you're going to find differences across in how teleological they are. And I think part of it is our belief at this point is there's a fundamental teleological impulse for both events in the world, but also for looking at animals and for looking at artifacts and so on. But you're exactly right that some adults and some cultures explicitly reinforce this teleological view. By telling kids, God created mountains and God to make so we would have something to climb on, and they created tigers to run around. And also, you lost your teddy bear. Well, that was God, our fate, making sure you'll remember next time when something more important comes up. And I wouldn't doubt for a second that would reinforce.
But that doesn't seem like it would be specific to religious parents, right? So I could, as an atheist parent, avoid telling my kid God made that mountain for you to climb on. But I might be equally likely to say, that's because you're got to take care of your stuff. And so, I guess that's an empirical question. But it would be a way of showing that science is like religion is like morality.
That's true. And that specific question is something which could be well addressed through, as you know, there's tons of transcripts of how parents speak to their children. And it would be very interesting, if you're right, and even atheist parents adopt a teleological style of explanation of everyday life. I hope that teaches you a lesson when talking to their kids. And although I think that children in our society are maybe more teleological than adults, because adults override their teleology, I have some other work with Coney, and Ara has some work independently, find that even people who are explicitly atheists do have some belief in fate and some belief in karma, or however you call it. Yeah?
I think I have to disagree with your idea that basically we just defer to scientific authority, because I'm unsurprised that people can't explain natural selection, because I think a lot of biologists don't really understand, or just in general, we don't understand very well what's going on, if it's acting on populations or individuals and so on. So I think it's kind of a very tricky question to ask people and then explain that they don't understand what they're talking about when they say they believe in evolution, because I think most people believe that, or they'll agree with Richard Dawkins because they've seen dinosaur bones and because they have some rudimentary idea about geology. Lots of people have heard of continental drift and so on and so forth. So it seems like there's a lot of possible data that can fit into that belief. And the fact that they can't explain a fairly technical thing that isn't even well understood by scientists, I don't think that's quite the same thing as just saying, oh, well, Richard Dawkins told me that. I just think there's a lot more going on. I think people do use a lot of the evidence available to them. And there's a lot of things available through popular culture and the media and so on and so forth that give you that information.
Well, I appreciate the comment. I'm going to stick to my guns here. Because I think natural selection, the way when it's asked, is not meant to be something extraordinarily subtle concept. It's meant to be the sort of thing one hopefully learns in high school or college. The idea that the idea of differential reproductive success, and so that the idea that there are different variants and some reproduce more than others. Anything like that gets a tick off as, boy, you got it cold. You don't have to know the subtleties of the group selection debate and everything. And people have no idea. And yes, they know there were dinosaur bones, but they're not much beyond that. If you don't like that example, we could choose another one. So I'm sure most people in the room, I'm not going to embarrass anybody, but most people in the room believe that the Earth is, say, over 1 billion years old. But how many of us can explain how we know this? Just out of curiosity, I can't. Anybody here could explain it? I won't ask you. I won't point to you and ask you. Okay, so anybody, somebody else? Somebody else? Sort of, but making the hand like, don't ask me. Good. So,
most people could explain why it is older than 6,000 years. So by just one theory, you automatically go to the next most available theory.
Fair enough. 6,000 years is a bit of. Actually, how do we know the Earth is more than 6,000 years old? I don't know.
Yes, then
it's like radioactive stuff.
Causal chain there. Like, even if I could come up with a really good answer about what we know about carbon decay, and then the oldest, tying that to rings and trees and things we can't actually observe, right? But then I'm still basing it on a certain level of trust that other really smart fellows have thought this through, and I'll go with what they say.
And I want to be clear. I'm not saying there's anything irrational about this. I defer to all sorts of things. I use Wikipedia. I ask scientists and everything. The world is too complicated to figure it all out ourselves. So if you don't like the natural selection example, there's a million other examples. And I also think that some of us have a sort of rationale for accepting scientists, believing scientists over, say, priests, in that we have a belief that the methods of science are better than the methods of religion or dreams or divination and so on. But I think my point is sort of a narrow one. I'm sure if I gave people 100 scientific questions, do you believe in electricity? Do you believe that the Earth revolves around the sun? Everyone will give you the accepted answers. But only a tiny minority of us could be able to understand why. Yes?
I want to press this point further, because it seems to me that there are different kinds of ignorance involved. Because to take your initial example of this wonderful comparison between 10 commandments and known and unknown and scientific facts, when you're speaking about commandments, there is no underlying mechanism to the commandments. You either know them or you don't know them. In terms of scientific facts, there is a fact, and there is a mechanism that explains the fact. So there is one more step in science. So to bring these questions on the level field, you would have to ask religious people. So how exactly 10 commandments came to exist in the way they exist? And there is a story behind it, but no one. To use your own argument, no one knows this story. Right? Even people who know 10 commandments, they don't. Well, some probably do. So, I mean, there is one more step, and I think we should distinguish these kinds of ignorance.
I think you're right, though. Again, I think that, as you were pointing out, this is yet another parallel. So there's all sorts of interesting theistic questions one could ask a believer, and typically, for the most part, believers are reasonably ignorant about the foundations, even in their own religious belief system, just like I'm ignorant of the foundations of my own scientific belief system. So, the question, like, you ask a Catholic about the Trinity, you ask specific question about people's religion, they're often lost. But they know who the experts are. They know who they could ask and find out. Yes? Then I'll go.
Thank you. Very stimulating, interesting talk. I want to ask you about a few things here, but I'll try and keep it concise if I can. You may have mentioned this during the talk, and I'm standing at the back. I came in late and I might have missed it. When you talk about religion, okay, if we make a distinction, say religion and spirituality, or religion and the highly documented mystical experience, and even your notion of theological, the whole notion of this form of religion is culturally biased in a framework, right? So a large proportion of the quote-unquote spiritualities or ways of understanding the world don't fit into that type of framework.
I entirely agree. Although that's a general conclusion which I believe, a conclusion that would mesh better if my talk is there's nothing special about religious belief. And admittedly, I just wrote that title down 10 minutes before I got to the talk. I figured so my arguments today only pertain to religious belief. So one might say, what about religious ritual? What about spirituality, that oceanic feeling, mystical experiences, and so on? And nothing I've said bears on bears on those phenomena.
So some work has been done by religious studies scholars that says that even this notion of religious belief, right, is in fact a Christian notion, even besides being a Judeo-Christian notion, right? The idea of faith, the idea of this. And I think that there's some interesting ways in which one might ask some slightly different questions about how when one has a spiritual experience or a mystical experience, then one interprets it based upon something that's cultural, something that's based within what one knows. And I think you're absolutely correct about science. And I'll just point out that the best scientists I know that we don't know a lot, right? And that we're always at the point where we need to doubt our beliefs. So science might prove one thing and then disprove it later, or something like that. And I think we're working on some very interesting things these days in terms of pushing that. So I guess the question, if there's a question, okay, is that I think what you're suggesting is that there is a cognitive way in which we think, which looks for this kind of purposeful causation, and that there's something in this thing, right, which does, and I think that may also be a highly cultural biased assumption.
So you're raising a lot of sort of different interesting points. There's the interesting question of how people across the world construe their own understanding of religion, whether they think of it in terms of a system of belief or a system of practice. And that, I don't have that much, or experience, exactly, that's a better way to put it. And that's I don't have that much to say about it. But I do, in fact, think that all humans have a set of beliefs, that we have belief systems that underlie our behavior and underlie our action. That's sort of a scientific claim about how the mind works, not controversial, I think. And that humans who both religious and non-religious have all sorts of beliefs that are of the interesting sort I'm interested in here. So a Buddhist, a Hindu, or whatever would have beliefs about the origin of the universe, about good fortune or karma, and so on. And that's what I'm interested in. Even though they themselves may not view it as in terms of beliefs, the scientific approach I'm taking will approach it in terms of beliefs. Yeah.
I have a question about the idea of double deference and sort of how you can tell the difference as a theorist between an instance of double deference and simply saying things but not really believing.
Yeah.
And the reason I'm worried about or interested in this is because there may be cases where people sort of acknowledge the official position in terms of the sentences that will come out of their mouth.
Yes.
But they have no idea. They just have no idea what they're talking about. And an asymmetry in the case of religious utterances versus some of the scientific cases might be that people's behavior will sometimes be completely at odds with the official position of religion, and that might be evidence that they don't even believe it, not that they sort of double defer believe it.
I think that's an important thought. I do think that there are things that fall into that category. I think the beliefs I'm interested in, a belief in God, a belief in life after death, belief in creationism, really are things people believe to be true. They aren't merely saying them. Even they believe to be true, and there's double deference at work. But you're exactly right that there are other beliefs that are more signals of one's fidelity to the religion. Sometimes they're ridiculous, in which case they're costly signals. Owen Flanagan tells the story of when the previous pope at one point said, there's no when you think of heaven as a place, that's ridiculous. Heaven is just a state of being in convergence with your God, in the here and now. And people didn't say, oh my God, the Pope is fallible, I have to revise my whole metaphysics. Flanagan said, everybody he knew said, the Pope has gone senile and lost his mind. He's denying the existence of heaven. And so I think something like the fallibility of the Pope is the sort of thing where most working Catholics don't believe it. He says something ridiculous, it's just ridiculous. But I think the existence of God is more of a standard double deference case.
What about a simple case like belief in life after death, but being extremely sad when someone dies?
So, right, so this comes up sometimes. So how could people sincerely say they believe in life after death when they're very sad when people die and when they fear death greatly themselves? If the religious believe in heaven, why don't they live their lives unafraid of death? I think in defense of the sincerity of religious belief, death is somewhat of a special case, where we have complex psychological systems that are very dedicated to not letting us die. And these systems work alongside other systems. So it's almost as if I could fully believe that a lion won't bite me, but still shiver and be reluctant to stick my hand in its mouth because there's so much sort of another system screaming at me. Tamar Gendler gives the example of standing at the pane of glass. There's a pane of glass in Grand Canyon, and you let it go down forever. And people know, if you step on it, it will support you. But they can't step on it. They shake and everything like that. I think even if I strongly believe in an afterlife, still, if in face of my own death, I'm going to be terrified. And the systems of grief that respond to death of another just can't be overridden. So I would say I would view that in terms of two competing systems. Yes?
You're talking about two challenges that you for how religious beliefs in particular might be special. One is how they change, and one is how they structure interactions between people. So how they change, you might have some purely beliefs about evolution, but I believe that I can sit down with you and run through a system of principled logic and lay out to you how it works, and eventually you'd be persuaded, that Lamarckian stuff, that doesn't make sense after all, and that would change your mind. And later on you'd meet someone else who had the wrong beliefs, and you could pass that on to them. Religious belief seems to be immune to this. There seems to be no principled way in which people explain religious beliefs to each other, but it's just transmitted, and people are really resistant to persuasion. The second
I have such a poor memory that when you got to the second one, I forget the first one. Oh my God, I'm already forgetting it. No, I got it. I see the point. I disagree. I think that although I'm a huge fan of rationality and rational inference and rational discussion, and I'll make that case tomorrow as changing moral views, I think we tend to overstate the amount that people's scientific views are changed by persuasion outside of us in a tiny subfield who do this for a living. And we also, and so the parallel, I think the connection between religious persuasion and scientific persuasion is the two are more similar than you would have it. So for instance, I actually don't think there's anything you would say to me that would cause me to dispense my belief in evolution. I don't think you could sit down with me and you could know many, you could persuade me, yes. If there is an issue that within the scientific worldview, I'm here and I should be here, you can move me. But this is true for religion as well. I can meet a new rabbi and he says, you think that that's kosher. It's not really kosher. I said, read this part. Oh, I didn't know that. Okay, it's not kosher. So that's the parallel. So getting somebody getting me to disbelieve in evolution is like getting a theist to disbelieve in God. It can be done, But it can't be done by sitting down and raising some arguments. It's a huge, complicated process.
The second challenge is they cause people to interact differently. So if I know you have a particular evolutionary belief or you don't believe in evolution, I might feel like we can have a very interesting conversation of some sort. But that'd be all. Well, if I know that I share the same religious beliefs as you, that causes very different interaction. Maybe I have very big trust for you as a consequence of that. Maybe I'll try to kill you or not trust you at all or hate you because of your religious beliefs. The interaction between beliefs and people seems to be very different.
I think you're right, but I think it's a difference in degree and not in kind. So what you're pointing out correctly is that religious beliefs will express a religious identity. And this religious identity could be will be salient, and a clash in identities could lead to horrific violence. Or trust. But I think a scientific belief also indicates an identity. It's just that the identity of us as the community of scientists is a weaker community in this world we live in now than the community, say, of Jews or Muslims or Christians. So to some extent, that's why I'm agreeing with you. With religion, I'm not going to kill you for having a different scientific belief than me, but religious people will kill each other for different religious beliefs. But on the other hand, there have been times when scientific communities have sort of gone to war with each other with various degrees of violence. And also, as a simpler case, there's some extent of affiliation. If I was in a community full of people who were strong creationists, and I'm feeling, everybody's a strong creationist, and then you whisper to me, Darwin rules. Oh, my brother! So there'd be that. It wouldn't. I agree with you. Because of other factors, that religious communities have all sorts of mechanisms to make them stronger and tighter than scientific communities. There is that difference. I just see in degree, not kind. Yes?
So it seems the nugget of your story here is that the way that we acquire religious beliefs is not particularly special.
Yes.
But the pedagogical stance that teachers take in teaching science versus teaching religion is very different, right? So in science, like say elementary school classes, they're demonstrating science all the time in some ways. Whereas when you're in a church mass, they're reading you these stories about other people and they're giving you testimonies, right? So what's the source of that pedagogy?
I think you're right. I think you're right. Although I think when you're taught science badly, as I was, which is why I don't know anything, you're taught as if it was religion. Okay, everybody write this down. E equals mc squared. Einstein was a great man, and then it's a lot like religion. But you're right. Scientific pedagogy has a potential to be rich and deep in a way that I think religious pedagogy typically doesn't. I mean, religious studies are different, but the religion itself, it typically doesn't. And that, I think, is a real difference. I'll admit that as a real difference, and it connects to the real difference between science and religion. Science and religion really are different types of institutions. And science has a cumulative property that religion typically doesn't, and that cumulative property, building insights upon insights and experiments and tests and falsifiability, will lend itself to different form of pedagogy. So that I would agree. I would also agree, by the way, that there are all sorts of differences in sort of scientific institutions and religious institutions, because science and religion are, again, different. Yeah?
You made a compelling case about the sort of proximate mechanisms behind these average everyday sort of quotidian devices are there and they're making sense for a world and they play out in religion, but do you see religious beliefs playing any ultimate role in terms of the promoting the replication of genes and survival?
I've been convinced by Ara and others that this is a matter of empirical fact, that religion does seem to be good for you reproduction-wise. There's a lot of evidence that religious people reproduce more, and that makes it natural to hypothesize that we've evolved, that a religion has emerged, it has evolved, just because of the reproductive benefits that it confers. So I have to entertain that as a possibility. But yeah, but when it comes to beliefs, I don't think the empirical evidence supports it, or at least I don't think it's in for that. So what I would need to believe this, what I need to accept this, is evidence for an early emerging religious belief that's not taught, yet doesn't fall out from other sort of broader stances that we know to exist. That's not part of our animistic bias or our creationist bias or our dualist bias or so on. And I've never found that. People have made the argument. So again, Jesse Bering said, look, people have an impulse to believe in a monotheistic God that observes them. And if that showed up in young children, that would suggest, wow, that belief is a biological adaptation. But there's just not a smidgen of evidence that it does. And both cross-culturally and developmentally, the evidence is that the idea of what Ara calls a big God is a cultural invention, not a biological one. So I don't actually think any religious beliefs per se have evolved, though because of the reproductive benefits associated with religion, it seems like a reasonable enough hypothesis. I'm just not sure it's true. Yes?
I really like your idea of the acquisition belief, and I'm wondering if you think that there, or if you could say something about the rejection of belief as an adult, or the, I guess, deference from one to another, from religious belief, rejecting it, and moving to scientific belief, and vice versa. Are they the same processes involved, or do you think it's some sort of exasperation, or it's a learned process that one goes through? Are they parallel? Are they completely different?
I'm embarrassed to keep referring back to Ara, but he wrote this wonderful analysis in the journal Trends in Cognitive Science about atheism and the different reasons why somebody might be or might become an atheist. And there's different sorts of ways. But I guess what I will propose in the spirit of this, there's nothing special about religion, is to say that the case of somebody religious becoming atheist can be perfectly the same as somebody atheist becoming religion. And what this would be an affiliation with a new group, trusting new people. So this leads to a prediction, which is somewhat common sense, for instance, that when people go, when adolescents go off to college or university, that's when they're at the point of maximum vulnerability. Either way. It's when you'll ditch your religious beliefs from an atheist background, or you'll suddenly acquire you'll either ditch your religious belief from a religious background or suddenly acquire religious beliefs. And I think that there's a certain case where the cases are exactly the same. It's just a shift in trust. A lot of people who buy into the scientific worldview know very little about science. They're just saying, I'm a cosmopolitan person who associates with people who watch certain TV programs and read certain newspapers and votes more liberal and rejects traditional values and is more, and so on. And part and parcel of that is, I believe in evolution. When you shift, part and parcel of your shift might be, you believe in special creation. Yes?
So your penultimate conclusion was that folk religion, folk science, and folk morality are all similar in relevant respects.
Yes.
And then that licenses this inference that there's nothing special about religion. But someone might wonder, well, wouldn't that also license this inference there's nothing really special about science either? And you might want to say, well, look, not all science is folk science. Are you saying that all religion is essentially folk religion?
You've got me on this logic thing. Fair enough. I think that there's nothing special about folk science or folk religion. I think folk morality has its own special things that distinguish them from these two. So I could have put brackets, sort of. What I would say is, in direct answer to your question, I think the gap, as a matter of fact, between folk science and real science is bigger than the gap between folk religion and real religion. So people talk about sort of theological incorrectness and so on, and the way in which... So one example is, for instance, that although almost all Christians are heavily dualist, scholars of Christianity point out the non-dualist foundations in Paul and others. And that's an example of a disjunct. And I accept this disjunct exists. But the disjunct for folk science and science is enormous. And the whole institution is so... And I think there's a principal reason for this, which is in part real religion as is practiced by institutions, although it's gone on its own course, is largely a manifestation of our folk beliefs about the world, among other things, while our scientific institutions are something very, very different. It's the discovery of a way of learning about the world that's gone crazy on its own course, leaving most of us mortals behind. Yes?
Part A and Part B.
Sure.
Part A is, in your world of research, do people talk about our innate tendency to be teleological, varying from individual to individual. So some of us are really untheological, others are really teleological. And then the part B is, are there some things we just can't believe because of this inherent tendency? So if we're really non-teleological, we'll never buy a personal God. And if we're really, really teleological, we'll never buy the idea of a mechanical universe. Is there something into that?
I think to answer part A, there's clearly variation between people. And there are actually scales. You could ask them questions. You could give them scales and so on. And whenever we do this, people vary. And I think some of the variance for these things is probably genetic to some extent, genetic tendencies in different ways. And some of it clearly is the culture to which they're exposed. I think there's enough room that the idea of a mechanistic universe can be at least understood by every neurologically normal person. And the idea of a personal deity shaping our fates can at least be understood and appreciated by every normal person. But I think there's a broader point here, which just to take off on what you're saying, which is our cognitive apparatus shapes how we understand the world at sort of a gut level. And I'm not the first to point out that a lot of the discoveries of, say, science, more so than religion, again, is take us to places where we have no intuitive grasp. And we just sort of learn it. We understand it maybe intellectually, maybe, but we have no feel for it. So quantum physics is your classic example. But I also think evolutionary theory itself is grossly unintuitive. The time spans, the subtlety of the difference, is such that you could understand it, but it's very difficult. And this is one way in which religion and science, I think, are different, which is religion, even religion, doesn't stray too far from our sort of psychological comfort zone, because then it wouldn't fulfill its purpose. Science could go such that, the scientific stuff could be just impossible to understand at any gut level. And so teleology is an interesting case study to look at that, since what most scientists would tell you is that we live in a profoundly non-teleological universe. It's there's no purpose and so on. And it's an interesting question how well that sits with people. It's an interesting question whether even people like me who sort of explicitly endorse this view really will, when pressed, when given a speeded reaction time study, when poked with the hot poker, will really say, that's what I truly believe. Yes?
I just wanted to follow up. You just said that if religious beliefs cause us to stray too far outside our psychological comfort zone, it wouldn't fulfill its purpose. But everything in the talk I thought was sort of doing the byproduct approach, roughly, which then has the conclusion that religion doesn't have a purpose. So I'm wondering what you think the purpose is.
Thanks for letting me clarify this. There are there's folk religion, which is what the folk believe. And this doesn't have a purpose. This is what we believe. Then there's religion, what the experts, the authorities, what's in the holy text, what's the sort of official version. These often do have a purpose because they're created by complex institutions. And complex institutions often have a purpose and often make expressions of belief and expressions of fact that serve their purpose. That say, you should do this and you shouldn't do this. This is good and this is bad, and so on. But scientific institutions can produce beliefs that make no sense, and we just say, "Wow, look what they've discovered over there." But if my local synagogue comes out with a belief that makes no sense and says, "This is what we now believe," they're failing in their purpose if the folk like me just has no understanding of it. It doesn't sit well with us.
The purposes are determined by the conscious intentions of the people who create the institution and keep it running. Is that it?
I would think so. I mean, I know there's some people who think that institutions sort of, as an emergent property of institutions, can have their own purposes and goals. But I'm thinking sort of in a more of a simple-minded way. Yeah, that the purposes are the purposes of people who are standing up saying, okay, everybody, this is what we believe. And that when they say that, they often have, an idea behind it. Yes?
Could you say a bit more about the way you use the word belief? As I listen very carefully to you, and I think you mean by belief, assumption, trust, opposite of knowledge, system of accepted foundational coordinates. And to me, you mix these criteria. Or to put it differently, in 2009 they asked eminent Darwinianists, do you believe in God or not? And half of them said yes, and the other half said no. So while I find it interesting all these foundational psychological mechanisms, and God knows, I find it, for instance, problematic when you say if a child does it, that means it's earlier. Somehow that's an assumption. I would say that's a working assumption. Because adults may have very complex reasons why they change things, and then when they get very old, they go back to what they were. I think there are a lot of things you simply feed into your research, which we then are made to believe. But it's really the term belief itself, which I would find, because it's not quite clear to me whether you are saying it's all the same, or one is better than the other, or we shouldn't have it at all. And what do you mean by belief? That's
really... Right. So let me clarify that. And then if you want, you could pursue some of the other issues, which sound interesting as well. But by belief, I mean it in sort of the standard English sense. So I started off with an analogy to kind of keep people going, which is, I believe grass is green, or most grass is green. That unsupported...
If you're colorblind, you don't believe this. And when you are a bee, you don't see that it's green. Green is not a... What is green? That's a perception thing, because we perceive light waves in a certain way.
Right. I'm not saying that bees believe grass is green. So it's true. It's true that I'll have a belief under certain circumstances. But here's a test. Here's a standard test you could do with adults to see if they believe something. You could ask them. So I could see, who here thinks the Earth is 200 years old? Who here thinks it's more than 200 years? Then people raise their hand, and that'll be evidence for people's belief. That's what I mean by belief.
Yeah, but I'm very uncomfortable. One thing is a scientific thing, and the other thing is a religious thing or a spiritual thing, and you harmonize these things in a way which for me is reductionist. And then it fits your argument.
That's an eloquent way of capturing the goal of my talk. To harmonize these things in a way that sort of reduces them to a singular psychological phenomenon.
The nature of religion, as you also said, it's always the same. That is, for instance, not true. And of course, there are very different ways in which religion can be communicated. And of course, you can have fanaticists, and God knows what they believe. You can also Dawkins is a fanaticist, even though he doesn't believe in God. But normally, people exercise religion by thinking about it. Religare means to go back to this over and over again. And if it doesn't stand, then you will abandon it. It's not just mindless. That was a bit mindless.
I think that's an interesting empirical claim, but I don't think it's true. I think that most people on Earth, most people in Canada, if you ask them about their religious beliefs, you won't discover that they do this. Theologians will do this, of course. Theologians are in many ways like scientists, but most religious people don't do that. I mean, again, there's data on this. We're not just making things up. There's tons of data asking people about their beliefs. One of the exciting facts about Gallup polls and the Pew polls is they're fascinated by religion. So thousands, by now millions of people have asked about their religious beliefs. And this reconstruction that you're doing may well be right for some people, but it doesn't seem to be right in general. Let me get somebody new. Yes?
I was just wondering how you felt. In my opinion, it doesn't seem that fair to actually pit creationism against natural selection, because creationism kind of requires a whole lot more, like everything, creating everything, whereas natural selection kind of starts when life started, and then humans, evolved from there, but it doesn't say anything about before that, like where did the matter for life begin. So it's almost like an unfair comparison.
Well, I wasn't trying to make them duke each other out. That's sort of a different talk. But to answer your question directly, the data, the contrast involve questions of the same scope. So it's questions like, where do animals come from? So it's not, you're right if the question was sort of where the universe comes from. Then natural selection has nothing to say about an enormous part of, under some views, but biological selection has nothing to say over most of the process, while a theistic view starts at ground zero and continues. So I'm just focusing on the origin of biological creatures, where I think those two are contending theories. So when you ask people, do you believe, and you give them the options, do you believe God created animals as they are? Do you believe God guided evolution? Or do you believe it was natural selection, evolution all the way down? People see these as three contending things. It's not apples and oranges. Does that seem that way with you?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I guess my question is then, how do you think that ratio would change, the percentages? If the third one wasn't, humans evolved from natural selection, but it was more like, science is working on understanding the beginning of the universe. Do you think a lot of people would jump ship then?
It's a good question. That third option, I wanted to find one that mentioned natural selection to sort of focus my, but often they just say evolution, or they just say evolved, or so on. The numbers stay pretty much the same. Because I think people, again, maybe you are coming from this, or you're a biologist, says, well, natural selection is a specific evolutionary mechanism, and there's other ones as well. But most people just view natural selection, evolution, Darwinism, as just as the sort of things that which science believes. And so the numbers don't change that much when you rephrase it. Yes?
His comment kind of reminded me of my question limits. I think it's probably way more of a critique for maybe some of the data that was not your data. But I struggle with that survey that had those three different options of creationism, God guiding development of animals, or natural selection. And the bottom two, to me, don't seem to be mutually exclusive. I think it would be very difficult, at least for maybe some subset of the population, to maybe believe both ones.
Well, sometimes they're framed, you're right, so sometimes you imagine they get blurred together. Often they're framed to be explicitly disjunctive. So they say, evolution occurred, but God guided it. And I think this was I think more or less the Gallup poll I presented. Evolution occurred, but God guided it. Or evolution occurred, but God didn't guide it. So it's made to be explicit. I agree that there's some ways, particularly unless you put in the option that evolution occurred and God played a role, the results get a bit messy. Because you find a lot of people say, yeah, I'm for evolution, but I think God had a guiding hand.
Let's take one more question.
Yes?
It's a bit like a paradox then, that some people can have two beliefs, because there are quite a few scientists who are religious, who believe in God. How do you explain this? It's two different beliefs in one person.
So you're exactly right. That people have beliefs that on the face of it would be inconsistent. So, for instance, as you pointed out before, as the one before mentioned, a lot of people who call themselves, who are actually evolutionary biologists, also believe in God. And a lot of people who are champions of natural selection believe that sort of God guided the process. I have nothing that interesting. I mean, people are really complicated, and I think what you see they're putting in this framework. I think you see multiple allegiances at work. So first thing, a working scientist doesn't have his or her beliefs because, I'm falling into this category. They really often have them because they've done the research, they understand it, and so on like that. But they might also be religious. They may also go to church. And they don't want to abandon their beliefs. They don't want to. I mean, to point Eric was leaning towards. They don't want to publicly announce their disrespect for the community they love, the people that they're allied with. So it puts them into a little bit of a pickle. And what people will have both beliefs, and then they'll slop on the third belief. They're compatible, and let's not talk about it. And so that's sort of how I make sense of that sort of paradox, as you put it.
I have a burning question. The burning question is this, and it addresses all these issues. I think you explain this in ultimately rational terms. You always seek rational explanation why someone is religious, or why someone is scientific, or why someone changed their mind. But what if it's not rational at all? What if you hugely overestimate the rationality in these choices?
Well, I'm not actually. The term rationality is a bit ambiguous there. So I'm not saying that people make their choices through the exercise of reason, through sort of conscious, deliberate, as rational typically is. In fact, part of my argument is that almost never occurs in these domains. Most people aren't religious people. Their identity isn't as a scholar of religion or something. So they just believe it because that's what they're supposed to believe. They do this double deference. However, it is rational in the sense that these are cognitive psychological mechanisms that do it. That it's neuronal mechanisms, psychological mechanisms. But what's the alternative? I mean, it's rational in the broad sense that there are reasons for it.
Well, I think distortionality is overrated, and we tend to find all this. And you say, we seek trust, and we seek this, and we seek that, and those are ultimately rational explanations. There is an ultimate because, and maybe there is no because at all.
Well, I would put you may be right. I mean, it may be that I'm used to being told I'm wrong. I'm sometimes told, not only are you wrong, but we'll never know the answer to this question. And then I get even more depressed. You're saying there may not be an answer to this question. For some reason, this is something which has no answer. I would find that very depressing. But I can see that might be true.
I think reason and rationality asks us to stop here and